Before starting the presentation, I want to thank Frank and Nicholas for inviting me to present in this seminar series. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure. And today I'm going to present you some analog models dealing with fault reactivation, both at the regional and at the local scale. These models were run in the frame of the GEMEX project, which is a Europe-Mexico cooperation project focused on the investigation and exploitation of the geothermal potential of two sites in the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt. So we are in Mexico, and in particular, the Los Humeros and the Acapulco calderas. So we, as analog modelers, were asked to run models to test hypotheses and to produce insights into the structural setting, both at the regional and at the local scale, to contribute in the building of the geological model. In this presentation, you will see two kinds of models. In the first part of the presentation, you will see models testing and investigating a rift propagation in tectonic settings versus the inherited structures in the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt. While in the second part of this presentation, you will see a focus on the local scale, and I will show you models of caldera collapse and their interaction with inherited structures. So let's start from the regional scale modeling. So we are in the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt, as said. This is a very large geological feature cross-cutting the whole Mexico, basically, and it trends from northwest toward the southeast. It is associated with the subduction of the Caucasus plate below the North American plate, and since Miocene paternity, it has experienced also extension, and this extension is supposed to be associated with the slab breaking, slab tearing, and sinking. And this process proceeds from northwest toward southeast. So in a sort of propagation of the extension toward this direction. This geological setting can be well reproduced in the lab with analog models by implementing a rotational tectonic setup. So with a setup like that, we can simulate this rift propagation. We have two moving plates that are hinged with pivots. So these are the poles of rotation, and the plates are moved apart so that the rift and the extension can propagate toward the poles of rotation. On this setup, we built a viscous layer, and on top of that, a brittle layer constituted by brittle material. So basically a sand mixture. In this sand mixture, we cut through with a knife, so that we created weak zones that can simulate inherited structures. We checked the orientation, and we aim to investigate the orientation that we specifically see in the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt, but we also applied a parametrical approach in order to test more trends for these inherited structures and to obtain more general insights. So in this slide, you can see how it appears, the reference model. The reference model is a simple model with no inherited structures introduced in the setup. And you can see, I can also start a short video here. You can see how the moving plates induce the extension and the propagation of the extension toward the the right side of this figure, which corresponds to the place where we have the pivots for plate rotation. If you look, for example, at the slope map, you can see that you have steeper faults in the area where the extension starts, and we have this sort of V-shaped fault pattern that propagate toward the poles of rotation. So we have a gradient of deformation that propagates from left to right. Okay. So if we then start to introduce the inherited discontinuities in the various models, and you can see how they were designed in these very small, I have to say, panels here. You can see that in some of the models, the reactivation is quite evident. For example, on this one, depending on the trend, of course. In other models, there's not any reactivation at all. So by doing this by applying this parametrical approach, we were able to create an existing fields to obtain an existing field for fault reactivation. So we know now that in between the 45 degrees and the 135 degrees angles, which is the angle between the inherited structure and the direction of rift propagation, we have the formation of strike-slip transfer zones. So we have hard linkage, basically, while above and below these values, we do not observe fault reactivation, but we observe soft linkage. So we have accommodation zones like the one you can see here. So somehow, despite they are not reactivated, the faults can still influence the rift propagation by inducing rift segmentation. Then we can observe a gradient of reactivation, which depends directly on the distance from the poles of rotation and on the trend of the discontinuities. So, for example, we can define a proximal distal gradient of reactivation, and this is quite simple to understand because, as you have seen, the rotational setting induce a gradient of deformation, which is higher in the distal part, in the distal portion of the model. So on the left part of the model, and it's smaller toward the poles of rotation. So inherited faults that are located far from the poles of rotation are more reactivated. On the other side, we can observe also an along strike gradient of deformation because depending on the trend of the faults, it happens that the faults are portion of the faults are closer to the poles of rotation. For example, the southern portion of these structures in this sketch here, and therefore they are less reactivated than the portion of the faults that are in a more distal position. Okay, so if we compare all these and we go to check the specific models that better fit with the case of the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt, we can see, for example, that in the central portion of the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt, which is called the Morelia-Hanbei fault system, we have these right lateral strike-slip faults, which are supposed to be reactivated. This is in agreement with our model, and it says that fault reactivation here might have occurred as a consequence of the rift propagation. Okay. Also, in the easternmost portion of the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt, where the Acapulco and the Los Humeros calderas are located, we can observe this sort of trend. And apparently, the two caldera systems are located at the intersection between two trends of inherited structures, one of which can be favorably oriented, according to our models, for reactivation. This is important because the intersection between this kind of faults can create favorable conditions for fluid migration and for emplacement of magma, and therefore for the emplacement of volcanic centers and the consequent caldera collapse. So this is the large-scale image of the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt. And now we can skip and we can focus better on the local scale to investigate the influence of the inherited structures on the volcanic system of the Los Humeros and the Acapulco complexes. So from the field, we know that in this area, there are inherited structures. And it seems that these structures might have controlled the geometry of the two caldera systems. And in fact, if you check the geological maps, for example, you can see that some of the external caldera ring faults appear quite rectilinear. So our aim was to test by introducing inherited structures in analog models of caldera collapse, if these faults were really able to influence and to exert a control on the structuring of these collapsed calderas. We produced 4 experimental series. A first one taken as reference, again, with no discontinuity, as in the case of the large-scale regional modeling, with no discontinuities introduced in the setup. And the setup is basically represented by a magma chamber placed below a sequence of brittle material simulating the overburden. then we can drain out the magma chamber from the bottom, and we can induce the collapse of the material above. In the other experimental series, we introduced the inherited discontinuities, which were of two types. Overburden discontinuities, so they were placed above the magma chamber, which is still circular, and they were realized by cutting through the sand pile again. Then we simulated substrate discontinuities by designing the magma chamber with one or two rectilinear sides, and this shape should simulate faults that bound the magma chamber and therefore generate a different shape for it. And in the last series, we simulated the condition of both inherited structures type. So we had substrate discontinuities represented by straight sides in the magma chamber, and then we also placed inherited discontinuities by cutting through the sand in correspondence of the substrate discontinuities, but in the overburden. So this again is the reference model where you can see how the model develops. So the caldera collapse starts with an incipient collapse and the formation of inner reverse fault. You can see them in the cross section, are those one, of course. And then at a certain point, the deformation shifts in other positions, and there is the creation and the propagation of the normal inward dipping faults that constitute the ring faults. This evolutionary model well fits with models already known in the literature, for example, suggested by Acocella, that says that at the beginning you have this outward dipping reverse fault, and then you have the development of the inward dipping normal fault. So our setup is able to reproduce this standard evolution. But if you then start to introduce in the model inherited structures in the way I've shown you in the slide before, you can immediately see that this standard evolution it's quite is not always happening, because for example you obtain rectilinear straight sides bounding the caldera, and you don't have circular ring faults anymore. And most importantly, in the inner portion of the caldera, for example, in this area here, you don't have portion of the reverse fault system. So if we talk about that members and we compare, for example, one model from each experimental series, you can see that you have the standard models where you have the circular caldera with the inner reverse fault and the outer normal ring faults. If you then introduce a discontinuity only in the overburden, you have rectilinear features inside the caldera, which correspond to the reactivated faults, but you still have a circular caldera. While if you introduce inherited discontinuity only in the substrate, so by creating straight sides for the magma chamber, what you get is still the presence of both systems. So you still have the outer normal faults and the inner reverse faults, but those are rectilinear. Most important is the last case, where you have discontinuities both in the overburden and in the substrate, because you have straight rectilinear side in correspondence of the reactivated structure, but you don't have in some portion of the caldera the reverse fault system. This is quite clear in the cross section, where you have the inherited structures, you lack the reverse fault, likely because the reverse structures, the inherited structures is promptly reactivated during the collapse, and this inhibits the formation of the reverse fault in the middle of the caldera. So if you compare these models with the case studies of the Los Humeros and Acapulco, you can see that there is quite a straightforward similarity in terms of geometry. In both cases, for example, comparing this last model, which is the one with the discontinuities in the substrate and in the overburden, the reactivation of these inherited structures appears to have controlled quite a lot the geometry and the structure of these collapsed calderas. Interestingly, in the middle of these calderas, apparently there is not any evidence of reverse fault. The one you see here in blue is actually not the reverse fault system, but is another nested caldera. So these are normal faults associated with another smaller caldera inside the Los Humeros caldera. So apparently there's not any reverse fault system. This, of course, may be associated with a variety of issues, for example, with the presence of volcanic deposits that drape the internal portion of the caldera. But it's something to bear in mind when you are building the structural models, because as, for example, we have seen in the first presentation, faults, inherited faults, and permeability of the faults in general is quite important for geothermal purposes, because, for example, in this case, they were the target for geothermal exploration, but they were not able to find them. So one solution could be that they are masked and they still have to be better investigated to be found. But the other solution could be that they are actually missing because of the reactivation of the inherited structures. So, well, that's it. With these models, we have shown how the inherited structures are important both at the regional scale in the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt, but may also be more important at the local scale, especially when you are investigating this kind of geological features for geothermal purposes. So that's it. Thank you.